Father Donald, please. I beg you, don't do this to me. Father, please! She screamed out. After being accused of falsely framing Father Donald, Judith loses everything. Frank, her childhood friend, betrays her. And Favor, the only witness to the truth, seals her fate with lies. The parish council sides with Father Donald, and Judith's own father disowns her. Banished from her home, she is sent to live with her strict grandmother, who treats her as a disgrace. Alone and shunned, Judith clings to the only thing she has left, her unborn child, and her determination to one day expose the truth. The tree had become my only friend. Its shade was the only thing that offered me any comfort in this suffocating place. I sat beneath it, my back pressed against its rough bark, my knees pulled close to my chest, and I stared at the world around me with empty eyes. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since I was cast out like I never mattered. 3 weeks since my parents turned their backs on me. 3 weeks since I became nothing more than a stain they wanted to erase. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. But even worse than my parents' rejection, even worse than my grandmother's coldness, was them. Favor. Frank. How could they? How could Favor, my best friend, the girl I had shared my secrets with, the one who knew me better than anyone, look me in the eye and lie? And Frank? Frank, who had once sworn to protect me, who had promised to stand by my side no matter what. Frank, whose laughter had once been my favorite sound, whose friendship had felt like home. He had thrown me to the wolves. For what? For money? For approval? I hugged my knees tighter, my body shaking with a mixture of sorrow and rage. The betrayal wasn't just painful, it was unbelievable. These were people I had trusted with my life, and they had turned away so easily, so effortlessly, as if I had never mattered to them at all. Father Donald sat in his office, his fingers gliding over the crisp pages of the documents spread out before him. The room smelled of old books and polished wood, a scent that once brought him comfort, but today it only filled him with impatience. His ordination was just days away. The moment he had fought so hard for was finally within his grasp, and yet he felt no real sense of victory, only relief. Relief that he had managed to survive the storm, that he had come out of it not only unscathed but elevated. To the church, he was a martyr. The parishioners spoke his name with reverence, whispering in hushed tones about how he had endured false accusations with unwavering faith. The archdiocese had done everything in their power to ensure that his ordination would be a grand affair, as if to erase every shadow of doubt that had ever been cast upon him. They praised him, they celebrated him, and soon he would stand before them all, wearing the robes of a fully ordained priest, a symbol of victory, of redemption. A slow smile curled at the corners of his lips. Yes, he had won. Reaching for a pen, he dipped it into the inkwell and signed another document with steady, practiced strokes. Each signature brought him closer to the moment when no one would ever question his authority again. A sharp knock at the door made him pause. His eyes flickered toward the entrance, irritation flashing across his face. He already knew who it was. With a controlled breath, he leaned back in his chair, adopting the calm, measured expression that had fooled so many before. "Come in," he said. The door creaked open and Favor stepped inside. She hesitated for only a second before shutting the door behind her, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Father Donald watched her, his expression unreadable. Favor had always been easy to manipulate. A little money, a few whispered promises, and she had been more than willing to play her part. But lately, she had become impatient, restless, and that could be dangerous. She stood there staring at him, her face twisted with frustration. "You promised," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Father Donald sighed as if the conversation bored him. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. "I told you," he said smoothly. "I will send it to you soon, probably before my ordination." Favor's hands tightened into fists. "I've been waiting for months," she snapped. You keep saying soon. When is soon? Father Donald's expression didn't change. Favor, he said, his voice slow, deliberate. I understand your frustration, but these things take time. You will have your money. Her eyes burned with anger. I kept my end of the deal, she hissed. I did everything you asked. Father Donald held up a hand, cutting her off. And I will keep my end, he said coolly, but you need to be patient. Favor's lips trembled. She had once been so confident, so sure of herself. But now, standing here before him, she looked small, desperate, and desperate people were dangerous. Father Donald's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his voice calm. Do not forget, he said softly, what is at stake here? Favor's breath hitched. For a moment her eyes darted to the floor, her resolve wavering. Father Donald pressed on. You have a future ahead of you, he continued, his tone almost gentle. Do not let your impatience ruin everything. Silence hung between them. Then, finally, Favor exhaled shakily and nodded. She swallowed hard. I just need the money soon, please. Father Donald offered her a reassuring smile. And you will have it, he said. Favor hesitated for another moment before turning toward the door. She reached for the handle, but before stepping out, she glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she slipped out of the room, shutting the door behind her. Father Donald sat still for a long moment, listening to the sound of her footsteps fading down the hall. Then, slowly, he exhaled. His fingers tapped against the desk, his mind already working through the next steps. Everything was falling into place. His ordination would proceed as planned. And Favor? Well, she would learn to be patient. Frank lay on his bed, staring at the neatly packed suitcase in the corner of his room. The excitement thrummed in his chest like a drumbeat, making it impossible to sleep. Dubai. It felt unreal. For so long he had dreamed of this moment, of leaving behind the small, suffocating town and stepping into a world of opportunity. He had pictured it all, the towering skyscrapers, the bustling streets, the life he would finally build for himself. And now, in just a few hours, it would no longer be a dream. He turned his head to glance at his phone, the bright numbers on the screen blinking back at him. 2:47 a.m., just a few more hours, and he would be on his way to Abuja. From there, he would board his flight to Dubai, and everything would change. A slow smile stretched across his lips. Father Donald had promised this would be his reward, a small price for betraying a friend. Frank sat up, running a hand through his hair. It wasn't guilt that kept him awake. No, he had long since buried any trace of that. What was done was done. Judith was in the past, a shadow in his story, and he had done what he had to do to secure his future. The thought settled in his mind like a stone. He exhaled, his eyes drifting back to his suitcase. Morning couldn't come fast enough. The journey to Abuja had been smooth at first. The bus hummed along the highway, the rhythmic movement lulling some of the passengers into sleep. Frank, however, was too wired to rest. He sat by the window watching the scenery blur past, his mind filled with the endless possibilities awaiting him. Dubai. The name alone carried a weight of success. He had spent hours scrolling through pictures on his phone, imagining himself there, walking along the marina, dressed in sharp suits, money in his pockets, power at his fingertips. This was his moment. He leaned back, letting the anticipation settle deep within him. Then, the bus lurched. At first, he thought it was just a pothole, but then came the screech of tires, the shouts of the driver, and then gunshots. Screams erupted. Passengers ducked, their bodies pressing into the seats, trembling hands covering their heads. Frank's breath caught in his throat. No, this can't be happening. The doors were yanked open, and men in dark clothing flooded in, guns pointed at them. Their voices were sharp, their words cutting through the air like knives. Frank's heart pounded as they moved through the bus, scanning each passenger with precision. And then, one of them stopped in front of him. Frank barely had time to react before rough hands grabbed him, yanking him from his seat. "Move!" Panic exploded inside him. He thrashed, tried to pull away, but the grip was ironclad. He looked around wildly, expecting them to take others, to empty the bus and demand ransoms, but no, they only wanted him. Why only him? Then, as they dragged him toward a waiting vehicle, one of the men pulled out a phone, dialed a number, and then, "Hello, Father, we have him." The words sliced through Frank like a blade. His body went rigid. "Father?" His mind reeled, trying to process what he had just heard. Number no, no, no. It couldn't be. Maybe he misheard. Maybe it was another father, another priest. But then the man spoke again. "Father Donald, what should we do with him?" Frank's stomach twisted violently. It was him. It was him. His mouth went dry, his breath coming in the shallow gasps. Father Donald had set him up. The realization sent a wave of nausea rolling through him. Why? Hadn't he done everything the man asked? Hadn't he lied for him, betrayed his own friend, played his part like a fool? Hadn't Father Donald promised him a future? And now he was nothing more than a loose end to be tied up. Frank clenched his jaw as they shoved him into the back of another vehicle, his hands bound, his vision blurred with rage and fear. The car sped off into the unknown, taking him further from everything he knew, everything he had dreamed of. And in that moment, Frank realized something chilling. He had traded his soul for a future that was never meant to be his. The place they took him to was dark, the air thick with dust and sweat. They tied him down, the ropes biting into his skin. And then they argued. He could hear them, their voices rising and falling, tension thick between them. Something about money, something about a share. Then, "I gave him 5 million naira cash. Take out 3 million for me tomorrow. The rest, split it among yourselves." Frank's blood ran cold. He wasn't just a target, he was payment. They weren't just going to kill him, they were going to profit from his death. The argument grew heated, voices turned sharp, accusations flew, and then chaos erupted. Fists swung, bodies crashed against walls. And in that moment, his moment, Frank moved. His hands had been tied, but not tightly enough. With a sharp twist, he yanked free, lunging forward, grabbing at the nearest thing, a phone. The man who had been holding it didn't even notice, too busy fighting for his cut. Frank wasted no time. He ran. His legs burned, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. Then, a gunshot. Pain exploded in his leg, white-hot, searing. Frank stumbled, his body screaming in agony, but he couldn't stop. Not now, not when he had finally seen the truth. Not when everything had been a lie. He pushed forward, forcing his body to move, ignoring the blood trailing behind him. He didn't know how far he ran, didn't know where he was going, but then, lights, a checkpoint, soldiers, salvation. His body collapsed before he could reach them, but his fingers fumbled with the phone, his vision blurring as he dialed. A number he hadn't called in years. It rang, once, twice, then. "Hello?" His mother's voice. Familiar. Warm. His throat closed. "Mama," he choked out. Then, before he could say more, everything faded to black. I knelt in the quiet corner of the chapel, my fingers moving numbly over the beads of my rosary. My lips trembled as I whispered each prayer, the words spilling from my mouth like a plea, a desperate cry for justice, for strength, for something, anything to remind me that I wasn't alone. That evening, as I sat outside staring at the fading sky, my grandmother's voice sliced through the air like a knife. "The man you tried to bring down will be ordained tomorrow." I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a twisted smirk tugging at her lips. Her words settled over me, cold and heavy. Father Donald, ordained. I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms. My grandmother must have seen the way my face twisted in pain because she laughed, a low, mocking sound. "You thought you could ruin him, didn't you?" she sneered. "And yet look at you, abandoned, rejected, left to rot while he rises." I felt my breath hitch, my throat tightening as tears burned behind my eyes. But this couldn't be happening. After everything, after all the humiliation, the suffering, he was still winning. It felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs, the weight of her words pressing down on me. But then, a calmness settled over me. I placed a hand over my stomach, feeling the faint movement beneath my palm. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, I said, "My God is still alive. He will fight for me." My grandmother's eyes darkened, and then, before I could react, she grabbed a pocket of water from the ground and threw it at me. The coldness of it shocked my skin, but what burned more was the hatred behind it. "Foolish girl," she spat, "your God has abandoned you." Her voice rang in my ears, but I refused to let her see my pain. I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I had to get away. Away from her cruelty. My feet pounded against the hard earth, my vision blurred by unshed tears. Then I felt it. The sharp, unforgiving edge of a stone beneath my foot. Pain exploded up my leg as I stumbled, my body lurching forward. And then, darkness. The first thing I felt was the cold. Then, a sharp burning pain in my abdomen. I gasped, my fingers grasping at the earth beneath me. Something warm trickled down my legs. Blood. A lot of blood. I heard a scream. It took me a moment to realize it was my grandmother. Her voice was distant, panicked. There were hands, many hands, grabbing me, lifting me. The world spun, my vision flickering in and out of focus. I tried to speak, to say something, but the pain stole my voice. I felt myself being carried, the sound of hurried footsteps, voices shouting for help. And then, the world faded again. The first thing I felt was emptiness. A deep, aching void inside me, one that stretched beyond the physical, beyond the pain, beyond the confusion that clouded my mind. I tried to move, but my body felt too heavy, as though I were being held down by something unseen. Then, voices, distant murmurs, footsteps, the beeping of a machine. Slowly, my eyelids fluttered open. White walls, a dim light flickering overhead. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled my nose. A hospital. I blinked, my mind struggling to piece together how I had gotten here. Then, a sharp pain stabbed through my abdomen. A gasp tore from my lips. Memories crashed into me all at once. The argument, the water, the fall, the blood, my baby. A strangled sob escaped me as I pressed a shaking hand to my stomach. It felt different. Too different. Something was missing. No, no, no. Panic surged through my veins. My breath quickened. My heart pounded. I tried to sit up, but my body protested, weak and aching. A figure moved beside me. I turned my head slowly, my vision still hazy, and saw my grandmother. She sat stiffly in a chair, her hands clasped together, fingers digging into her skin. For the first time since I had known her, she looked shaken. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. I already knew. Tears welled in my eyes as I turned back to the ceiling, swallowing the lump in my throat. It wasn't possible. I had felt my baby kicking just yesterday. I had whispered prayers over my stomach, promising to protect them, to love them no matter what. And now there was nothing. The door creaked open. A doctor stepped inside, his face unreadable. "She's awake," he said softly, as if I weren't even there. My grandmother nodded stiffly. The doctor hesitated, then turned his gaze to me. "Judith," he said gently, his voice filled with forced sympathy. "I'm so sorry, but we couldn't save the baby." The words hit me like a dagger to the chest. I felt them before I even processed them, like a knife slicing through my ribs, carving through flesh, leaving behind only a gaping wound. I sucked in a shaky breath, but it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough air in this room, wasn't enough air in the entire world to fill the emptiness inside me. My vision blurred. I barely registered the doctor murmuring something to my grandmother before stepping out, leaving us alone again. Silence stretched between us. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, my grandmother said, "It's over." I squeezed my eyes shut. Over. As if this was something that could be summed up in 2 words. As if this was just another inconvenience, something to move past, to forget. But how could I forget? How could I erase the memory of my baby's tiny kicks, the moments when I would lay my hands on my stomach and dream of a future that never came? A single tear slipped down my cheek. My grandmother sighed, shifting in her seat. "Rest," she said after a moment. "You'll need your strength." She stood up and left without another word. And I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, wondering how much more of me could be taken before there was nothing left. Meanwhile, miles away, the church bells rang. The ordination had begun. The air inside the church was thick with incense, the scent swirling through the grand cathedral like a veil of unseen hands pressing down on my chest. Even miles away, lying weak and drained in my hospital bed, I could feel it. I could feel the weight of what was happening at that very moment. The moment that was supposed to be a glorious victory for Father Donald. A celebration. A grand ordination. The congregation had gathered in their finest garments, their faces glowing with reverence. The choir's voices soared in perfect harmony, singing praises, filling the sacred hall with melodies meant for the divine. Golden light streamed through the stained glass windows, illuminating the altar where he stood, draped in his pristine vestments, his hands folded in a display of humility. Father Donald, the man they called a martyr, the man they defended, the man they worshipped. He stood before the bishop, a picture of solemnity, prepared to take his final vow. His moment of triumph, his moment of power, the moment the church would fully embrace the devil in disguise. Then, a scream, sharp, piercing. It shattered the sacred hymns, cutting through the ceremony like a blade through silk. The murmurs began immediately, heads turning, eyes widening in confusion. Then the scream came again, only this time it was clearer, closer. A woman pushing through the crowd, a woman whose face was twisted in a frenzy of emotion, anguish, desperation, fear, a woman who knew the truth. Favor. She ran towards the altar, her steps frantic, her hands clutching at her own arms as though something unseen was forcing her forward. Her breath was ragged, her voice trembling, yet loud enough for the entire church to hear. "Stop, stop this!" Gasps rippled through the crowd. Priests exchanged bewildered glances. The bishop paused, his hands still hovering over Father Donald's head. And Father Donald, his face paled. For the first time, his mask cracked. His fingers twitched. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He knew. He knew exactly why she was here. And he knew he couldn't stop her. Favor fell to her knees before the altar, sobbing uncontrollably. Her body convulsed as though something greater than her was working through her, pushing the truth out of her trembling lips. I can't hold it anymore," she wept. "I have to say it. I have to confess." The entire church fell silent, a strange, eerie silence, like the hush before a violent storm. Then she spoke. "Father Donald is a fraud," she cried, her voice breaking. "He's not who you think he is. He did terrible things. To me. To Judith." At the mention of my name, I could almost feel the shift in the air, the way the churchgoers tensed, the way the whispers started, the way eyes darted toward Father Donald. But she wasn't done. "He drugged me," she continued, her hands gripping at her chest, as if trying to claw the memory out of herself. "That day, the day Judith and I went to see him, he offered us drinks. I took the one meant for her. I thought it was harmless. I didn't know." Her voice broke into another sob. I woke up and he was there, on top of me. A collective gasp swept through the church. The altar trembled with the weight of her words. The bishop staggered back. The priests looked at one another in disbelief. And Father Donald? He didn't move. He couldn't move. His body was rigid, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Because he knew this was only the beginning. Favor's voice rose again, stronger now, as though the invisible force compelling her refused to let her stop. "He paid me," she screamed. "He paid me to betray Judith, to stand against her in front of the church council. He promised me money. He promised me comfort. He promised me everything if I just denied her. And I did it. I turned my back on my best friend for money. I ruined her life." Sobs racked her body, but she pushed through them. "But that wasn't enough for him," she whispered, her voice trembling. He wanted more. And She shook her head violently, her hands clawing at her own hair. "I let him use me." Tears streamed down her face. "Over and over and over again, I let him use me." The weight of her words sent a ripple of horror through the crowd. People clutched their rosaries. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others simply stared, frozen, unable to comprehend the depth of betrayal unfolding before them. "He told me to keep quiet," she continued. "Told me he'd keep paying me, and I did. I kept my mouth shut. I spent his money. I lived in comfort while Judith suffered." Her voice cracked. "But I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face. I kept feeling this presence." Her hands trembled violently. "Something has been following me, tormenting me. I don't know if it's God. I don't know if it's Judith's spirit. But I know this. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I couldn't let this man stand at this altar and take vows before God when he is nothing but a monster." She lifted her tear-streaked face, her eyes locking onto Father Donald's, and for the first time, the congregation turned their full attention to him. The whispers grew louder. The gasps turned to murmurs. The murmurs turned to accusations. Father Donald did not speak. His lips parted slightly as if searching for words. But there were none. No lies, no excuses, nothing. Because he knew. He had been caught. And no amount of deception could save him now. The church felt suffocating. The air, once filled with the scent of burning incense and fresh flowers, now carried something heavier. Betrayal. The walls, once a place of refuge, seemed to be closing in, trapping every soul within them, forcing them to witness the truth. And then I saw him. Frank. His presence sent a ripple through the crowd. He wasn't the same Frank who had once walked with so much pride, the boy who laughed easily, who had once held my trust in the palm of his hands. No, that Frank was gone. This one was broken. His right leg was bandaged, his body frail, his hands gripping crutches as though they were the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Yet despite his wounds, despite his pain, his eyes burned with something fierce. He dragged himself forward, the heavy thud of his crutches hitting the marble floor, the only sound in the now silent church. The people parted, stepping away as if sensing that something terrible was about to unfold. Then he stopped, right before the altar, right before Father Donald, the man who had orchestrated everything, the man they had all trusted. "You tried to kill me." His voice wasn't loud, but it didn't have to be. It carried the weight of truth, the weight of betrayal. Murmurs spread through the crowd, but Frank didn't waver. He reached into his pocket, his hands trembling as he pulled out something small and black. A phone, a lifeline to the truth. "I want you all to hear something." He tapped on the screen. The phone crackled, and then his voice, Father Donald's voice, cold, calculating, unmistakable. "Kill him on his way to Abuja. Make sure he doesn't make it." Gasps, screams, hands flying to mouths. Some people instinctively stepped away from Father Donald, as if he had suddenly become a curse, a disease, a monster. But Frank wasn't finished. The recording continued. the sound of another man, one of the kidnappers, asking for payment. And then, Father Donald's voice again. I gave him 5 million naira. Take out 3 million and deposit it in my account tomorrow. The rest, share amongst yourselves. I don't care what happens to him. Just make sure he doesn't get to Dubai. The audio ended. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then the first shattered sob. I turned my gaze and saw them, my parents. My mother's hands covered her mouth, her entire body trembling, her eyes wide, not just in horror, but in guilt. My father. A man who had always been so sure, so firm, so unshakable, looked like a man who had just been stripped of everything, his fists clenched at his sides, his gaze locked onto the man he had once defended. And in that moment, I knew that every ounce of doubt they had ever held about me was gone. I knew that the weight of their guilt would consume them, because now they understood. Now they saw. They had abandoned their daughter. They had turned their backs on me for a man who had done all of this. My mother took a step back, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." As if denying it would somehow undo it, as if refusing to believe it would change what had already been done. But the truth was undeniable, and the truth had finally come screaming into the light. I stood there, unseen, as the weight of everything crashed down upon them. The church, once filled with celebration, now reeked of betrayal, grief, and horror. Frank's revelation had shattered everything the people had come to witness an ordination. Instead, they bore witness to evil unmasked. Father Donald, the man they had adored, defended, and revered, stood exposed. His sins stripped bare before the altar where he had once knelt in false humility. And then, in the midst of the chaos, she came. My grandmother. She burst through the doors, her wail slicing through the silence like a knife to the throat. Her frail body trembled, her wrapper barely holding onto her bony frame as she staggered forward. Her feet were bare, covered in dust, as if she had run all the way here. "Where is he?" she cried, her voice raw, broken. "Where is Judith's father?" My mother turned, eyes wide with confusion. "Mama?" she whispered. The murmurs in the church grew louder. People turned, watching, waiting. My grandmother's knees hit the floor. "Judith is dead." The words hung in the air. A single sentence, yet it silenced an entire church. My mother froze. Frank, still gripping his crutches, staggered backward. Favor, already on her knees in her own spiral of confession and regret, let out a choked gasp. And my father, the man who had refused to believe me, who had once thrown his trust so easily to another, stood rooted to the spot, his face pale, his lips slightly parted, like a man who had just felt his soul leave his body. The church spun around them. I could feel it, the way the world collapsed beneath their feet, the weight of their choices, the weight of their failure. My grandmother held something in her trembling hands, a folded paper, a letter. She looked up at my father, her eyes filled with a grief so deep it threatened to swallow her whole. "She left this for you." Slowly, as if in a trance. My father stepped forward. His hands shook as he took it from her. For a moment he just stared at it, as if he was afraid of what it would say, as if he knew that whatever was written on that page would be his undoing. Then his fingers unfolded the letter, and he read, "Dear Church, I write this with a heart that no longer seeks justice nor revenge, only release. I was once one of you, a girl raised in faith, taught to believe that the church was a home, a refuge, a place where truth thrived and justice lived. I was taught that God sees all, that he does not forsake the innocent, that he does not let evil go unpunished. But I learned that men are not like God. I learned that the hands I trusted to bless me could also destroy me. I was betrayed by those I called friends, by those who stood before this altar and swore to serve God, not themselves, by my own family. I remember when the accusations first fell upon me. I remember the looks of disgust, the whispers, the judgment. She is a disgrace. She is a liar. She is an enemy of the church. I knelt before the same altar where Father Donald stands today, and I begged God to let the truth be known. But you did not want the truth. You wanted a villain, and so you made me one. Father Donald, the man you defended, the man you celebrated, was not who you thought he was. But deep down, maybe you always knew. Maybe you chose not to see, because it was easier to believe that a young girl, poor, voiceless, unwanted, was the sinner, rather than the man who wore a cassock and spoke of God. But one thing I have learned is this: truth does not die. You may bury it, you may silence it, you may crush it beneath the weight of your lies, but one day, the truth will find you, and when it does, it will demand to be heard. I wonder, does it feel heavy now? The weight of knowing that you stood on the wrong side? That you let the innocent suffer while the guilty thrived? Does it burn inside you? It should. Because this is the same fire that burned inside me every day as I carried the burden of your rejection. You pushed me out, left me to wander in a world that had no place for me. I lived in shadows, whispered my prayers through tears, and clutched my stomach as I felt my child, my only light, fade from within me. I called out for help. None of you answered. And now, I am gone. Not because God abandoned me, but because you did. You will weep for me now. I know you will. You will cry, you will mourn, you will say you regret it all. But I do not need your pity. I do not need your regrets. I needed your belief when I was still alive. I needed your hands to hold mine when I was slipping. I needed your voices to stand beside me, not against me. But you were silent. And silence, I have learned, is just another form of murder. To my mother, I loved you. Even when you turned your back, even when your eyes refused to see me, I still loved you. I waited for you to fight for me, but you never did. And now, as I stand before you, no longer flesh, no longer burdened by pain, I have only one thing left to say. You should have believed me. I have been sitting here for a long time, watching, waiting. From the moment they lowered my body into the ground, I have been here, unseen but ever present. The wind moves through the trees, whispering through the grass above my grave, carrying my story to those who will listen. And now they all know the truth. Father Donald, stripped of his priestly robes, shackled like the criminal he always was, will never see the outside of a prison again. He was always so careful, always so sure no one would ever catch him. But evil has a way of exposing itself when it becomes too greedy. Frank, my friend, my brother in all but blood, paid the price for his betrayal. He stands now with only one leg, forever reminded of what his selfishness cost him. I have watched him struggle, seen the torment in his eyes. He wishes he could undo it all, but regret is a prison of its own. Favor, once so proud, so sure of herself, now sits in the emptiness she created. She betrayed me for money, for security, for a lie. And in the end, she lost everything. A womb that will never bear life, a heart that will never know peace. And my parents, oh, how they weep. My mother clutches my letter to her chest, as if she can squeeze the life back into it, into me. My father no longer walks with pride, but with sorrow, his head bowed under the weight of all the times he should have believed me but didn't. They sit in silence together in their grief. I have watched them all, listening to their cries, feeling the pain that lingers in their souls. And I have hated them. I have hated them for every moment they let me suffer, For every time I begged for love and they turned away. For the life they stole from me, the child I never got to hold, the breath that was ripped from my lungs before I had a chance to live. But hate is heavy, and I am tired. The world has heard my story now. My name will not be forgotten. My truth will not be buried with me. And so, I release it all. I forgive you, all of you. Not because you deserve it, but because I do. I have sat here long enough. It is time to rest. Slowly I rise from my grave. The earth beneath me is soft, welcoming. The wind carries my whisper one last time before I close my eyes. And as I sink into the darkness, vanishing into the peace I have longed for, I know I am finally free. I finally rested in peace. The end. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on the notification bell so you won't miss out on our latest stories.